West Papua's history is very much like that of Western Sahara in terms of the story of its occupation. In the 1950s, after Indonesia got independence, the Dutch kept control of West Papua as a territory because they are ethnically, racially different, in terms of religion, different to Indonesia, and were never intended to be part of the Indonesian state. They were on the non-self-governing territories list, which meant that the United Nations and the international community, and the Dutch in particular, had a sacred obligation, they call it the Sacred Trust under the UN Charter, to bring West Papua to self-government and to give them the opportunity for decolonisation. In that process, the West Papuan people had their own parliament, had their own national flag, had their own national anthem, and in fact many states attended the inauguration of their parliament in the early 1960s. But Indonesia then threatened to invade because they claimed the territory as their own, and because of the Cold War dynamics, the Dutch and Australia were going to go to war to protect West Papua from Indonesian invasion and to live up to their duties under the UN Charter. But then the United States stepped in with a concern about the Cold War, and a deal was brokered called the New York Agreement of 1962. In that agreement, West Papuans were not consulted. It was an agreement made between the governments of Indonesia, the Netherlands and the United States. But under that agreement, they agreed for the first ever UN-administered territory. People in Western Sahara understand that because you have a UN mission here at the moment. But this was the first time that the United Nations would take control of a territory and administer it as their own, as part of a post-conflict situation. But under the terms of that agreement, administration and supervision would transfer to Indonesia with the obligation that they give the people of West Papua a vote on self-determination, in which they would determine whether they would remain part of Indonesia or whether they would be an independent state. What happened in the years leading up to that referendum is that Indonesia conducted a campaign of violence, which is well documented and was reported in British and US diplomatic cables. There were fears of intended genocide amongst the inhabitants of West Papua. The vote itself, under international law, it is required that every adult, man and woman, is entitled to vote in a referendum on the self-determination of a peoples. In the case of West Papua's referendum, which is ironically called the Act of Free Choice, Indonesia rounded up just 1,200 and just over 1,200 West Papuan leaders and forced them to vote under threat of violence for integration with Indonesia. So it's no wonder that the vote was unanimously in favour of integration with Indonesia, when everyone at the time, including all of the reports in diplomatic cables, showed that West Papuans were overwhelmingly 95-99% in favour of independence. You would think that the United Nations, who had the responsibility of supervising this vote, would report back to the United Nations about this. Nothing was said. They simply accepted the outcome. There were many reports that have since come out where they admit that it was a whitewash, and in fact there are diplomatic cables where people refer to the people of West Papua being too primitive to make a decision for themselves, which is not only racist but completely contrary to international law and the requirements of decolonisation. Since that time, West Papua has been under occupation of Indonesia, unlawful occupation, because the referendum did not comply with the requirements of international law. West Papuans have suffered mass killings, torture, abuse, exploitation of their traditional lands, rape, abhorrent conditions, discrimination, and treated incredibly differently to those of Indonesia. Like here in the occupied Western Sahara, Indonesia, like Morocco, have moved transmigrants from other parts of Indonesia so that West Papuans are now becoming a minority in their own land. There is a media blockout. It's very difficult to get information out. There's no access for international observers. No foreign media are allowed in. This is how Indonesia is able to keep the situation quiet. But with the advent of social media and the internet, more and more stories are coming out about the occupation, and about the violence that's perpetrated against the West Papuan people. So as a lawyer for the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, we have been doing a lot of work internationally to establish the legal case, to demonstrate to the world that this is a just cause, that international law is on West Papua's side, and that the United Nations and the international community have an obligation to provide the West Papuans a proper referendum on their future so that they can decide for themselves, as was implicitly and explicitly accepted by all of the parties in the New York Agreement. They are entitled to a referendum, and it has to be done properly, just as it has to happen here in Western Sahara. Referendums are, in a democracy, under the international rule of law in a democracy, referendums are the appropriate way of gauging the population's will. That is the determinant of self-determination. We need to understand what it is that the people of a country want to have happen with their future, and the referendum is the only way that we can adequately consult the people on their future. As in the case of Western Sahara, natural resources and the role of multinational corporations are key to maintaining Indonesia's occupation of West Papua, and indeed were a key motivator and driver between both Indonesia's actions in invading West Papua and in Western countries like the United States' complicity in allowing that to happen in order to control the natural resources within West Papua. In the case of West Papua, they discovered during Indonesian occupation of West Papua, before the UN vote on self-determination, they discovered the biggest deposit of gold and copper in the world. 2 years before the West Papuans had the vote in West Papua, the vote as we call it, the US and Indonesia signed a deal for Freeport Gold Mine, as I said, the biggest gold and copper mine in the world, which already indicated that other countries were divvying up the resources of the West Papuan people before they even had an opportunity to decide on their future. That has continued until today. In West Papua contributes something like 25% of Indonesia's GDP, hundreds of billions of dollars a year in logging, in natural oil and gas, in gold and copper. These resources are a key reason why occupied nations, occupying powers take control, so that they can control these resources. Unfortunately, it is, as a matter of international law, unlawful and illegal to be using those natural resources in the context of an occupation. The resources belong to the people. They belong to the people of West Papua. They belong to the people of Western Sahara. And it's unlawful to be taking them in the context of an unlawful occupation. Unfortunately, though, how do we implement this under international law? This is the challenge. There aren't sufficient protections and safeguards against multinational corporations when they move outside of their own territory, and there's insufficient ways for us as lawyers and as occupied peoples to be able to enforce those protections against multinational corporations operating abroad. For me, being here in the camps in Dakhla and being hosted by a Western Saharan family has been incredibly eye-opening and inspiring in terms of seeing with my own eyes the injustices and the suffering of your people, but also for us seeing the similarities between the situation in West Papua and Western Sahara and the tactics and strategies used by Morocco and Indonesia, and how incredible it is that how incredibly similar they are. And that's really has, I think, renewed our commitment to the cause of West Papua, the just cause of West Papua's fighting against unlawful occupation, but also a sense of building solidarity with you in Western Sahara, and how we can think about developing combined strategies together to achieve the freedom that you all deserve.